Welcome everybody to the first Cantor Forum of the 2021-22 academic year. So I'm Ursula Heise, I'm the chair of the Department of English, and it's a great pleasure to be able to open our series of Cantor Forums for this year. Let me start this event by acknowledging the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the original land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And as always, when we make this acknowledgement on Zoom, it feels a bit strange since not all of us, in fact, share a physical space with a specific history. But of course, many of the places that we all log in from at this moment share a history of dispossession of indigenous peoples. And so in spite of our geographical disconnection, it still makes sense to, and it's all the more important to acknowledge just how important the stewardship, the original stewardship and ownership of land has been as the place from where we launch into this digital space. So let me tell you just very briefly about the Cantor Forum. The Cantor Forum had its origin in a set of significant gifts that Penny and Ed Cantor made to UCLA, and that aimed to enrich the intellectual environment of the campus and the community at large. And that their philanthropy produced a wide range of continuing resources for both faculty and graduate students. So there's the Penny and Ed Cantor Prize Fund, the Penny Cantor Dissertation Award, and the Penny Cantor Endowed Chair in Women's Studies, which is in the Center for the Study of Women. The Penny Cantor Fellowship in British Studies at the Clark Memorial Library, and the Cantor Forum that you're participating in. So the Cantor Forum wants to promote dialogue about the current condition and the future of literary and cultural studies. And our emphasis over the years has been on exploring and engaging with new theoretical paradigms and critical perspectives and just developments in humanistic scholarship. So the annual series is usually 3 events, and every time it brings distinguished scholars to UCLA, each of whom pursues a different articulation of literature's critical purchase and seeks to expand the parameters of literary discourse to include new and sometimes surprising engagements with cultural, archival, and historical materials. I'm very grateful to the English Department Speakers Planning Committee, which came up with the topic of this year's series of forums, which is literature and political activism, with a specific title for today's session being Crisis and Intervention. And the Speakers Committee actually came up with that in early 2020, and we thought it was going to be for last academic year, but then it got delayed to this year because of the pandemic. So today's conversation is between our colleague Saree Makdisi, who's in our department, and our guest, Bruce Robbins from the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. And that conversation will be moderated by Yogita Goyal, who's professor and vice chair of undergraduate studies in our department with a cross appointment in African American studies. And so just to introduce Yogita briefly, she's a distinguished scholar and theorist of post-colonial literature, especially African literatures and literatures of the African diaspora, as well as American literature. Her last book is called Runaway Genres, The Global Afterlives of Slavery, came out in 2019. And that is just, it's a brilliant book that traces how the story template of the slave narrative underlies a lot of different types of narratives about current human rights abuses. It's won practically all the major prizes you could possibly win last year. And given how much Yogita's work in this book, but also in her other publications, engages with the intersection between literature and geopolitics, she is the perfect moderator for this conversation. And I was absolutely thrilled when she graciously agreed to take on this task. So Yogita, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ursula, and thanks to Marta for helping us organize this event, and to Chris for helping with the tech. May I request that people who are able to do so turn on their videos? I know we're all used to Zoom and kind of, being in this kind of passive format, but it would be really wonderful to try and at least create the illusion that we're in a room together and we can at least see your faces if you're able to do so. I'm very grateful to our speakers today, Bruce Robbins and Saree Makdisi, for sharing their thoughts on crisis and intervention with us. We're hoping to talk broadly about the work of literature and of literary scholars, in helping us understand the multiple crises of our times, as well as talk together about possible forms of intervention. Both Bruce and Saree have written eloquently about ongoing legacies of empire and colonialism, urgent questions of human rights, genocide, and dispossession. And in a lot of ways, though we had some quibbles about the exact term itself, I think they both embody public intellectuals, and maybe we'll get to some of those quibbles in a couple of minutes. Let me do a brief introduction for both of them, and then we'll get them going on this conversation. Bruce Robbins is Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. He has written widely about 19th and 20th century fiction, literary and cultural theory, and postcolonial studies. One of his longstanding concerns across the range of this work is economic inequality, questions of class, question of work and poverty, the welfare state, and he considers these topics in such books as Upward Mobility and the Common Good Toward a Literary History of the Welfare State, which came out from Princeton in 2007, and The Servant's Hand, English Fiction from Below, Columbia 1986. He has also written extensively about cosmopolitanism, or what he sometimes calls cosmopolitics, which is the title of his co-edited collection from 1998. Recently, he's continued this exploration. Cosmopolitanisms is another co-edited book, which came out with NYU Press in 2017, and Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence from Duke in 2012. Yet another consistent concern in his work is the limits and the dynamics of humanitarianism and the imagined or actual relations among the West and the rest, the first world and the third world. And he's offered various provocations on this subject, and I think we'll talk about some of these today, including Feeling Global, Internationalism in Distress, NYU 99, and most recently, The Beneficiary, published by Duke University Press in December 2017. So welcome, Bruce, to our department. We're really looking forward to talking to you. Saree Makdisi, our colleague, is professor of English at UCLA, and he writes at the crossroads of several different fields, including British Romanticism, imperial culture, colonial and postcolonial theory, and criticism. In books like Reading William Blake, Cambridge 2015, William Blake and the Impossible History of the 1790s, Chicago 2003, and Romantic Imperialism, Cambridge 98, he makes a compelling argument for what he's elsewhere called a worldly romanticism. He's also interested in the cultures of urban modernity, particularly the revision and contestation of charged urban spaces, including London, Beirut, and Jerusalem. He takes up London in particular in Making England Western, Occidentalism, Race, and Imperial Culture, Chicago 2014. Perhaps most germane to our conversation today, he's also the author of Palestine Inside Out, An Everyday Occupation, which came out with Norton in 2010, where he focuses on ordinary Palestinian lives, navigating the everyday brutalities of occupation, permits and passes, curfews and closures, thus explaining how Israel's walling off of Gaza and the West Bank creates open-air prisons in effect. His latest book, I believe, is called Tolerance is a Wasteland, and I'm hoping we'll hear a little bit more about it today. He's also written extensively on the afterlives of colonialism in the contemporary Arab world and about Palestine in such venues as the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the London Review of Books. So welcome, Saree, welcome, Bruce. We're really happy to get this conversation going, and it's really wonderful to see such a great attendance in the audience. As we've discussed, I'll get us started by asking each of you to sort of describe your process of coming to what we might call activism. And I understand there's sometimes a hesitation around that label, but I believe Bruce has a story for us, and Saree will talk to us a little bit about his involvement with Palestine to get us started. So Bruce, would you like to get us started?
Sure. First of all, I'm really grateful for the invitation and very honored to be here, sort of. The story, it sort of is, well, I also feel, although honored, not entirely the appropriate person to be doing this, because I have always been a very reluctant activist. I mean, I sort of technically lived through 1968 and so on as a student, but had really very little to do with it other than marching around under other people's banners from time to time. It was like a big deal for me to get my homework done. And I didn't understand how the people who were marching all the time had done their homework already and therefore were able to go around marching. So, you know, I sort of didn't go out into the world to do political activism at all, and blundered into it in a weird way. I was co-editor of this left-wing cultural journal that some of you of a certain age will have heard of, called Social Text, in 1996, when Social Text was hoaxed by the physicist Alan Sokal. And we came to look in the eyes of a great many people like the stupidest people on the planet. And I found myself speaking in public sort of to save the cultural capital that I had accumulated since being invited by Cornell West to be involved in Social Text in 1984. So I found myself speaking in public, debating Alan Sokal, not really liking Alan Sokal very much, not really liking my side in it extremely, but you know, speaking in public. And then 6 years go by, and in 2000, that was in 1996, in 2002, Alan Sokal sends me an email thinking that we're buddies, having debated each other some years before, and we're not buddies. But he sends me an open letter of American Jews to our government. And I look at it and I think, I could just delete it. It's probably really, I'll be happier if I just delete it. I don't like Alan Sokal. You know, I didn't like what he did, but okay, I'll read it. And I read it and it was pretty good. And I wrote back and I sent a couple of suggestions to make it even better. And then I sent it in the spirit of the thing to two people who I thought might disagree with each other as much as Alan Sokal and I disagreed about certain things, namely Elaine Showalter and Judith Butler, who different sides of feminism, if you like. And both of them wrote back and also made suggestions. And I thought, okay, we're onto something here. People who disagree about a lot of other things in their kind of citizenly role in the world really might agree and might sign on to things and actually get something going. And it just turned out that Alan Sokal and I organized this petition and raised money for it illegally, and bought ourselves a page of the New York Times. I found a designer to put the 4,000 some odd signatures in a really elegant design, showing all these American Jews who were telling our government, look, there's a certain right on both sides, but you know, if Israel won't abide by the UN resolutions, then the US should cut off all aid. And this was really kind of cool. I got put on television. I felt important. I felt like this was like, you know, cool anyway. And it got picked up. It got translated into Arabic, into Hebrew, into various other languages. It got, you know, published in places around the world. It felt really better than writing another good analysis of Bleak House. You know, it felt like a different kind of thing. And we did it again in 2006. We raised some more money and we did it again. By this point, it seemed to me that, it seemed to both of us, that people were not reading the newspapers so much. They were reading their news online. They weren't getting political ads. It didn't have quite the same impact the second time round. Anyway, I really am going to try to cut this short, although I could go on and on. And we had some money left over, and Alan Sokal had left the country, was living in Europe. So I was really doing all the legwork myself. And I had this money because hundreds and hundreds of letters had come in from American Jews. Thank you for doing this. People don't know that we feel this way. You are giving us a voice. This is fabulous. I mean, I have a collection of these letters, and people would send in checks. You know, I sound like Bernie Sanders, but $25, $27, you know, small checks, but there were a lot of them. And I had $15,000 left over after the 2006 version. And I thought, okay, I got to do something with this money, and probably another ad is not going to be the idea. I'll make a film. I didn't really have a very good idea how much money it takes to make a film, but I thought I'll give the $15,000 to someone who knows better than I do. And one thing led to another. I made a film as amateurish as the day is long, but one of your fellow LA people from the film industry, James Seamus, who teaches film at Columbia and whom I had met, gave me a great title, I thought a great title. Some of my best friends are Zionists. This was an answer to the question that I asked, what's it like being in Hollywood, you know, and having the beliefs about Israel and Palestine that you have. And he said, what do you mean? You know, some of my best friends are Zionists. Great title. Judith Butler refused to appear in a film with that title. She said, none of my best friends are Zionists. I have lost friends because they were Zionists. I said, Judith, our families are Zionists. Come on, you can do this. It is the only argument I ever won against Judith Butler. She appears and is great. Is kind of a star of the film. Anyway, so when you make a film, then people invite you to go around and talk about it, and that sort of really has defined such activism as I have done. First of all, the open letter, and then that film, and then once I had made one film, I thought I'd make another one about the Israeli historian Shlomo Sand, who wrote the Invention of the Jewish People. So I'm a filmmaker. I mean, I have no idea how to make a film, but that has been the style of the activism. End of story.
Thank you. I've always loved the SoCal hoax, and it's funny to think that something good came out of it. Saree?
Sorry, you have loved the SoCal hoax?
Well, I like I mean, it's a moment, right?
We are going to have to talk. Okay.
Loved. We will talk.
Well, I don't think of myself as an activist. We had this discussion when we were in the planning stage for this event, and I said I don't think of myself as an activist. I think an activist is somebody who organizes things and brings people together and does things and makes things, facilitates things happening and so forth. And I don't think of myself in that way at all. In terms of my, if you want, my political awareness, let's say, and my sense that I have to say something and do something, that's very strong. And I had no choice about it, because I grew up during a war. I grew up during the war in Lebanon. And, you know, when you grow up in a war, you see the world differently than I suppose people who don't grow up in wars. You see what injustice looks like, and it's very, 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 very personal. And you see it up front and close and in its ugliest possible form. And, you know, inevitably part of the war in Lebanon was the Israeli invasion, multiple Israeli invasions of Lebanon, at the siege of Beirut in 1982 that I lived through with my family. So for me, this is, you know, it was something I didn't have a choice about. It was something that's also deeply, deeply felt. And it made me, you know, from the moment I came back to the US for my last year of high school and college and graduate school and so on, it just made me keenly aware of the fact that not everybody sees the world from the way I do, for instance, the way people where I come from do, and it made me want to speak out about it and to try to bring a little bit more perspective, a little bit more knowledge, or at least a different kind of perspective, a different kind of knowledge to the US. And then that was that sensation of feeling the need and feeling almost compelled to speak was you know, sort of multiplied by the experience that anybody who's an Arab in America, especially since 9/11, can speak to as well. This is not my experience by any means uniquely. It's what any Arab in America feels, as long as they're aware of being an Arab. And it has to do with feeling this strange thing of being sort of, you know, somebody that people don't really, from a place that people don't fundamentally really understand, and again, having this perspective that seems not to fit in various kinds of ways. And I've just always felt the need to speak about it, to write about it. And so that's what I've done in the ways that I can. I mean, I did a little bit in college, a little bit in graduate school, but mostly in a kind of public way. It took off by writing a lot of articles in the LA Times over the years since I got to UCLA, really. And that kind of opened the door to other kinds of things. And TV stuff and radio stuff and so on and so forth. But yeah, I've just felt a need to do it, and I think it's something that people like us are well qualified to be able to do, because we read a lot, we think a lot. We have, as far as I'm concerned, one of the main benefits of even the system, the institution of tenure is to give you the kind of political and intellectual protection to be able to speak out without having to worry too unduly about your job and your position and your kind of institutional location. And so that's what I do. That's why I do that side of what I do. And I mean, I go back kind of like Bruce in a way. I have these multiple kind of identities. I mean, I work on British literature and Blake above all, London and other things like that. But then I also have this side where I'm writing about Palestine, and I've written about Lebanon. I've written about the Arab world more generally. I've written about Beirut and Jerusalem and so on. But yeah, that's kind of where I come from. It comes from my own personal experience growing up and then being an Arab in America.
I guess in some ways, Saree, I've always wanted to ask you this, and what you just said sort of leads us there. Do you find that the work that you do in Romanticism, does it feel complementary to the work that you do with these kinds of more political questions in the public sphere? Or do they just seem like separate projects in your mind? Like, do you feel like you're using a different part of your brain? Are there tensions that you see there? Because obviously your work in Romanticism is also focused on empire in a lot of ways, right? And it's thinking about questions of race and modernity in complementary ways. And I was thinking about this in particular because, Bruce, you said, yet another analysis of Bleak House. And I was struck sort of looking over your career by the range of your literary objects. Right, so that there's, Middlemarch, there's Netherland, there's Never Let Me Go, there's Lucy, and in some ways, George Orwell is really the hero of The Beneficiary. And I found myself sort of comparing, Bruce, what you do with George Orwell to Saree, what you do with Blake. I don't know if the two of you might like to talk about that a little bit.
That's a great question. Bruce, do you want to go ahead?
Go first.
I mean, Blake, so the weird thing about Blake is that he occupies this very strange position, on the one hand being central in many ways to certainly British Romanticism, but British culture, more generally, all the way up to the present, I would say, in various kinds of ways. And yet he also is deeply, profoundly misunderstood, in all kinds of ways as well. I mean, there's this attempt, for example, to take one of the things he wrote and turn it into kind of an specifically English nationalist kind of jingoistic thing connected to soccer culture in England, and I think that would have made him turn in his grave. So Blake, this figure who's kind of central to all kinds of things, but also so profoundly alienated and misunderstood, and in his own lifetime profoundly alienated because people thought he was crazy, and maybe he was crazy, I don't know, but he opens up again this a way of seeing things from a marginalized position that opens up a range of ways of thinking and ways of imagining the world. And that's part of what Blake means to me, and that's why he's important. But I mean, to go back to your original question, Yogita, no, I don't think of these things as, I mean, it's weird. I suppose they cross-pollinate in my own head, since they're both going on in my own head, but I don't think of them, I don't explicitly think of them. I say it's not true. Sometimes these two parts of my writing do kind of make a connection, and it's when I'm talking about, specifically when I'm talking about displacement of people, that always, I feel that very sharp. Like, for example, the chapter on London and making England Western, I talk about the displacement of tens of thousands of people from the center of London in the 19th century as London was made more modern and more Western and so forth. And it involved massive home demolition and displacement of, as I said, all these tens of thousands of people. And if you're Palestinian, you cannot but think about mass displacement, with a certain kind of, emotional as well as rational and sort of political and intellectual approach. Same thing in my first book, Romantic Imperialism, when I talk about the cleansing of the Scottish Highlands, the western part of Scotland. Again, similarly in Ireland, you can't, if you're Palestinian, you're coming from the perspective of the Palestinian experience, you can't you have to think. It seems like it's kind of, it's involuntary to think about these things in a very felt way, as something like a shared experience. So yeah, I mean, there are moments when these two parts of my work overlap and come into contact, but they're mostly kind of, they sort of happen, semi-autonomously from one another. Bruce?
Yeah, I don't think Orwell is as much of a hero to me as maybe Blake is to you. I think the fundamental thing for me is that, I sort of come out of the New Left, and one thing that distinguished the New Left was a desire to get out of Cold War binaries, to just say that politics shouldn't be defined in the way that the Cold War got them defined. And Orwell was very, very much a figure of, those Cold War binaries, taking this side of the so-called free world. And I thought I could kind of salvage him a little bit as a more interesting thinker, the early Orwell, where he's really thinking about global inequality and global injustice, and thinking, I mean, from the point of view of generating anti-fascist solidarity, what would you have to do? Well, you would have to somehow be able to say to people in the colonies or former colonies, then actual colonies, we're ready to accept a kind of leveling of life chances between, we know that even our workers are a lot better off than your workers. So worker solidarity is not going to work by itself. And Orwell has these really incredible arguments early on, saying, in the name of a kind of serious internationalism. And that's the kind of Orwell who never gets taught, right? It's not 1984, or Animal Farm. So, I wanted to pull that off. The more relevant answer for me about the intersection between my academic work and the political work would probably be via cosmopolitanism, in the sense that I think I kind of got lucky. Other people in the 90s sort of started a wave of thinking in terms of cosmopolitanism, which caught on, in particular anthropologists. For it's another story, but I don't want to go on about it. I thought in the middle of the culture wars, it was cool to be able to take an ancient Greek term, which I could actually write out in Greek if I wanted to, in debate situations, and I did it, and use it to cover the extremely scandalous concern with people of color and colonial peoples and so on, and say, we're only doing what Diogenes sort of told us to do. So it was convenient. It was a convenient slogan in moments of polemic, but as it became a very easy label to sort of claim, where it just sort of became, a synonym for hybridity, or, liking ethnic food, or, things that really aren't too serious. I was drawn more and more to the sort of the normative strenuousness of it, which I summarize as, you're kind of not a cosmopolitan unless you're willing to stand up against your country when your country is, for example, committing atrocities against another country, bombing it or invading it or whatever. The real test of cosmopolitanism is a kind of self-accusation. And that, of course, overlaps with my life, both as a Jew and as an American. In both cases, there's all this stuff that was happening in my name, which I wanted to say, not in my name. So there's a kind of personal motive and an intellectual motive that sort of come together there.
I'm really glad you brought us to the question of cosmopolitanism, because I think in many ways you've been searching for the perfect prefix that could capture a lot of the tensions that you've just articulated, right? So you've talked about actually existing cosmopolitanism, you've talked about dirty cosmopolitanisms, right? Like there is, and obviously vernacular cosmopolitanisms is another term that's been around. I'm wondering if, do you find that do you come up against the limits of the term, especially in relationship to the status of the nation as a concept, right? And again, I'm aware that these are debates that have been going on, especially in this, since the 90s, sort of seemingly endlessly. But I'm thinking about, in particular, both of you have, and this might be another place of maybe of a slight difference, both of you have expressed an interest in what we could call something like a left universalism, and in salvaging liberal humanism, sort of acknowledging the violent legacies that are a part of its history, but also salvaging some key principles. And I think in some ways, both of you turn to people like Edward Said to draw on some of those possibilities. And I think, Bruce, in your case, tell me if I'm reading this correctly, this also tends to get linked to a defense of close reading as an aesthetic practice, or something that we do in the classroom. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, either if you could talk a little bit about these questions about liberal humanism, to what extent is it useful for us in our sort of current moment of multiple converging crises, when we've already had a lot of critiques, defenses, counter critiques of these ideas, and do we come up against certain limits?
Wow, that's really a mouthful. So let's see. One of the reasons why I told the story, or pointed to the story of how I started using the word cosmopolitanism in the context of the culture wars of the 1990s. That is to say, in a debate context, more a debate context than really a conceptual, abstract, intellectual context. They are saying certain things about us. Why are you always talking about the bad things that our country is doing? Why aren't you more patriotic? You're betraying your tradition, your heritage. And it was kind of convenient at that moment to say, hey, there's this ancient Greek concept, associated with Diogenes and the Stoics and so on, which called basically for us to do stuff like that. This was a way of me saying, I've never been entirely committed to it conceptually. It's never been anything like an ideal term. It's obviously very tainted by elitism and so on and so forth. So it was pragmatically useful to me. And I've been kind of curious and a bit charmed that it has caught on as well as it has. But I never felt that I could give it a wholehearted defense. Maybe another way to say this, and I welcome the opportunity to introduce Saree to Edward Said. I don't think he knows his work very well, and I'd really like to tell him a little bit about Edward Said's commitment to humanism. But no, I'll leave that to him to speak about, if he desires. The intellectual historian David Hollinger made a distinction between the old cosmopolitanism and the new cosmopolitanism, which I have sort of picked up. The old cosmopolitanism being kind of Martha Nussbaum and universalism. Shamelessly Western, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The new cosmopolitanism, according to Hollinger, is the one that gets all these adjectives you were talking about. I mean, all the modifiers, always qualified, right? Limited, restricted, located. Actually existing, I guess, was one of mine. It didn't really catch on all that well. The point is, what everybody knows is there are lots of cosmopolitanisms with adjectival modifiers, right? Which are kind of restricted. And those are the new ones for Hollinger. And they are not universalistic. They are kind of empirical and descriptive. They lend themselves to study, in particular, by anthropologists, historians, literary people, and in particular to the study of diasporic communities, where there are multiple loyalties and identifications, right? So you look at actual people on the ground who have connection to more than one place, and that's your empirical, descriptive, actually existing cosmopolitanism, rather than really applying the sort of normative criterion to it. it seems to me that a lot of the work, and maybe the most productive and useful work that has been done, has really been done under the rubric of what Hollinger calls new cosmopolitanism. And I think that's great. However, over the last years, I couldn't tell you exactly how many years, I've gotten a little bit impatient about some of the work that has been done under that rubric, because it seemed to me people were still using it as an honorific, but we're not asking whether the honor was earned by friction, let's say, with any of those particular loyalties. So American Jews who are more loyal to Israel than Israelis are, you know, that's a diasporic community that's kind of failed the normative test. Indians in Vancouver who are kind of supporting Hindu nationalism against Muslims, who are more intolerant of Muslims in India than the Hindus in India are, they are better described as long distance nationalists than as cosmopolitans. There is a lot de facto on the ground of cosmopolitanism, so called, that really doesn't merit the name as far as I'm concerned. So I have found myself slipping back in the direction of the old normative one, a more universalistic one, and applying the criterion, okay, are you ready to be critical of your country at a moment when it may not be very convenient to be critical of your country? I don't know if that is exactly what you were looking for, but it does describe where I feel like I'm at.
If I could just add to that, I mean, that's a great way of putting it, Bruce. And to go back to what you're saying about a sense of feeling the ability to be critical of your own country. And I mean, one could come at this from different perspectives. One has to do with the question of diasporic communities, or in other words, being connected to multiple communities and hence having multiple forms of cultural and political and other kinds of national identities and other kinds of identities as well. It opens you up to a sense of never quite, at least personally, again, never quite feeling like belonging wholeheartedly to one at the expense of others, always sort of moving and feeling comfortable moving in between. In some ways, I've always been jealous of people who can attach themselves wholeheartedly to one particular, national or racial or ethnic or whatever kind of position, and identify, entirely with it because I'm not able to do that. And again, not by choice. It's not, I can't, because of who I am, because of my own, complicated background, and also, of course, because of my, my intellectual and political principles. But in this case, they happen to, and this is one of those cases where they happen to reinforce and enable one another, right? This sense of, if you belong to multiple communities and you don't really feel, it's entirely absorbed into one particular place or one particular identity, one particular location, you're actually moving among and between them. That opens up the possibility of thinking about other people moving in similar kinds of dynamics, and indeed all of us ultimately being able to move in that sort of, not deracinated, but this kind of a network, a mobile network of multiplicity and various forms of affiliation that free us from the tyranny of monoculture in a way. And I think, like, Stuart Hall talks about this really, really powerfully, I think, in his last book, the sense of sort of embracing a diasporic condition, and embracing that sense of displacement rather than insisting on trying to heal it and to kind of reattach to some national location in a way. It's actually one of the most interesting aspects of that last book of Hall's last book is his it's part of what he criticizes Zionism for, is this moment where what could have turned from a kind of an embrace of diasporic, multiplicity of cultures, gets turned around and becomes this reaffirmation of a single identity in a way, and attempt to kind of reattach to the single identity using whatever violence was necessary. So I think part of what's really interesting here is what the kinds of connections that can be made given a diasporic condition, and hence the kinds of, to go back to Yogita's question, or the earlier version of the question, in terms of, opening up, returning to a certain kind of set of humanistic principles, And the ones that come to mind, of course, for me, obviously, Edward Said is a very important, inspiration. But so are people like Frantz Fanon, for example, who, in Wretched of the Earth talks about what it means to try to set afoot a new human being who's not connected in a binary set of relations in opposition to, whatever the other happens to be, but can move among and between them more freely. And what would that new human or new humanity and in fact new humanism look like, that's connected to a politics of liberation and freedom rather than empire and racism and so forth. Those are really, really powerful ways of thinking, I think.
Can I make a quick amendment to what I said before? It's okay. It occurs to me that I may have sounded like I was speaking against belonging and kind of in favor of just critical detachment. I don't know whether that's true, but if so, I'm actually trying to think about a mode of belonging, which is maybe different than what we usually think of as belonging. I give a quick example. I was a respondent to Benedict Anderson once, who is the origin of this phrase long distance nationalism. And we were talking, anyway, I don't go through the whole thing, but we were talking about I think he says this somewhere in print, that people imagine belonging as a matter of pride, but in fact, it might be more useful to think of belonging in terms of shame, because you're not ashamed unless you feel you belong. And as I was getting up from the restaurant, because I had childcare responsibilities, he kind of lifted his glass and said, "Let's drink to shame." And I'm not saying that it's the model of belonging, but it helps you understand that there are ways of acknowledging that you do belong, that you're not simply an exile, but at the same time where, critique is part of the belonging. So I'd say it for what it's worth. And I would want to claim actually Stuart Hall as somebody who offers a model of how to belong. And this may seem to me to sort of pushing hard on something a little bit unlikely, but Stuart Hall in 1990, there was a cultural studies conference at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, where he spoke, and he was asked about the phrase theoretical gains, that he seemed to think that there had been theoretical gains, that they're in progress in cultural studies. And the questioner said, "You can't really believe in that. I mean, from the moment when race and gender and sexuality come in, we have to stop thinking in terms of progress, don't we?" I'm paraphrasing. And Stuart Hall thought about it and said, "No, actually, absolutely not. You can think about progress. And in fact, you have to think about progress." And now I'm putting words in his mouth. You can only think about progress if you think you belong. That there's a model of scholarship where you can think of maybe progress in your own career, but you're not going to be able to imagine progress in any other dimension. And Stuart Hall is someone who absolutely never stopped thinking in terms of progress, because he saw himself as part of a movement more than he thought of himself as part of anything else. And if you're part of a movement, you want that movement to make progress. I am terrified that some of our darkest diagnoses of what's wrong with the world are convenient in the sense that they're so dark that you can't imagine ever doing anything about them, right? And therefore you won't. And Stuart Hall never gave into that. There was never any diagnosis that he made that did not allow for him and the people he collaborated with to do something that would make a difference. I think he's absolutely the example from that point of view.
I think that might be a really wonderful place to for us to talk a little bit more about your arguments, Bruce, and the beneficiary. And I think they appear here not only in relationship to what you just said about Hall and belonging to a movement and not just producing analyses, right, for the sake of producing analyses, But really that idea of shame that you brought up with Benedict Anderson. And I think in some ways, I don't know that you use this word, but I do think that there's some shaming involved in getting us to think about the beneficiary as a concept. And I wanted to actually just quote a couple of moments from the book, just to kind of refresh our collective memories as we think about the ideas that you're offering us. So you quote Orwell in the book, in order that England may live in comparative comfort, 100 million Indians must live on the verge of starvation, an evil state of affairs, but you acquiesce in it every time you step in a taxi or eat a plate of strawberries and cream. And that's something that you draw on to get us to think about ourselves as beneficiaries of the complete, utter inequality of the world that we live in every day. And so the beneficiary was published in 2017, as you know, and so that was before the disruptions of COVID-19. It was before the protests that followed George Floyd's killing in Minnesota. And yet many of the things that you're saying in that book, and I'm thinking especially about the conclusion of the book, where you have this kind of wonderful riff on you can't handle the truth from the movie, right? That we all know. And it's a really kind of wonderful evocation of some of those ideas. So I wanted to ask you, given that much of what you're talking about in that book has become even more pronounced in the last year or two, right? Like if we just think about something like, vaccines, right? And there are many terms that are being used. Saree, you've written about apartheid as a model for Palestine. You've written about the architecture of erasure. And then, Bruce, you've written about economic Orientalism as a kind of phenomenon that helps us understand what's going on. So there's been various terms that have been offered recently: vaccine apartheid, vaccine imperialism, vaccine genocide, for obvious reasons, because these scenes, Bruce, that you bring to our mind, both in Beneficiary and earlier in Sweatshop Sublime, of us sitting in our homes and drinking tea, right? And thinking about where the tea is coming from, the sugar that we're stirring into it, slavery, right? All of those kinds of things have become even more pronounced because we can be on Zoom, and the essential workers who can't be on Zoom are delivering our stuff to us. So I'm just wondering if you've rethought or do you have reflections on some of the things that have changed, or maybe you want to dig down further into the insights that you gave us in that book. But it just seems like the book is speaking so powerfully to all of the things that we are experiencing on kind of a daily basis these days. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you for that. Wow. I'm surprised that anybody needs to have their memories refreshed. I thought everybody had memorized that book, which would help explain why all of 13 copies have been sold. No, I actually, it feels a little bit like a failure, not just a publishing failure, but a failure in the sense that what I was hoping for was to sort of give a boost to humanitarian, the sort of apolitical humanitarianism that's out there. We share a common humanity. You see people suffering. How can you stand to see people suffering, and to live such a comfortable life when people are suffering? What I hoped was to draw a causal connection between their suffering and our comfort, to say, let's actually follow the lines of causality. They're not, humanitarians don't really like doing that because they don't actually want to shame the potential donors. But the historical fact is that so it seems to me, there are very, very tight causal lines that can be drawn between, the suffering of people in place X and the comfort of people in place Y. So I was kind of hoping, can we get on board with this? You ought to be able to gin up a little extra feeling on behalf of some kind of global justice. And it seems, to have been kind of a non-starter, which is, I would say, true of most of my ideas. So, I haven't been, I of course think that it's relevant to questions of reparations. reparations for slavery, reparations for Native Americans, that it's part of an argument, you know, that should be better received, it seems to me, than it is. But there's a sort of, you know, a strange sense that I now am not responsible for things that were done 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, whatever. That was, you know, a different universe, and I have nothing in common with the people who did that. I don't belong to them. So this is part of the belonging argument. First, you would have to get people to feel that they belong in order to get them to feel that to take a distance from what was done. If they don't feel that they belong, and here I'm kind of quoting Walter Michaels, more or less, you know, I'm me here in the future, in the present. What is I have to do with that? Reparations would be, you know, giving things to people in response to things that were not done to them, and what we would give to them would be given by people who didn't do those things. Anyway, you know, that there's no belonging, there's no continuity, there's no connection. So you would sort of, I mean, this is the very perversely patriotic side of my argument for cosmopolitanism. If you can't get people to feel that they belong, you won't be able to get them to sort of feel shame. Shame is a mode of belonging, and therefore feel, okay, reparations are in order. That's the best I can do.
I mean, I would say, Bruce, I don't know if I agree with your assessment of the reception of the beneficiary, but if you're right, I would say that it only proves your argument further, right? That people are not ready to be hailed as beneficiaries, and they would rather be hailed as people who are critical of, you know, the world that we see around us. Because, you know, this is another, you know, you say this very directly, who is a beneficiary? You are. Probably if you had not benefited from some ambitious higher education, it seems unlikely that you would be dipping into a book with so earnest and unpromising a title as this one. So your audience in some ways is, you know, us, right? Like US literature professors, academic left, and so on. And maybe that audience doesn't want to think about, you know, its complicity, to invoke a term that Michael Rothberg, who I believe is here, also uses as he thinks about the implicated subject.
He wrote a very tough but fair review. Hi, Michael, of The Beneficiary. I mean, not a review, a commentary on it in his book. Michael, consider yourself interrogated, interpellated.
So I know that we're going to have a ton of questions from the audience, but if I could maybe ask a couple more quick questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And I should say people should feel free to write it in the chat, but you can also just, when the time comes, unmute and you know, ask your question. Saree, I noticed that the title of your new book, if I'm not mistaken, it used to be called Palestine and the Psychogeography of Denial. And you were thinking about questions of tolerance, democracy, eco-consciousness, how they've played a key role in denying Palestinian presence and claims to Palestine. And now I believe it's titled Tolerance is a Wasteland. And so I'm just wondering if you'll give us a sneak preview of some of the things that you were thinking of there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the centerpiece of the book is a reading of the project that many of you probably know about called the Museum of Tolerance, which is an institution based in LA that has been busy for the past, I've lost track, like 15 years, I think, it's been building a museum, well, a branch called the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem. And it turned out pretty early on that the site that they're building this monument to so-called tolerance on had been the most important Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem. And they were busy kind of literally removing bodies from this Muslim cemetery, which goes back to the time of the Crusades, to build this monument to tolerance. And so, I mean, I've written about that in other places too, but I was kind of, the question all along is, you know, what's going on with the affirmation of a value like tolerance in a situation like that, where, you know, it's being invoked, it's the cause that's being championed in, you know, while literally a kind of ethnic cleansing of the graveyard is taking place. Well, what's this bizarre inverted and perverse kind of relationship. You know, what's going on in this dynamic, and that led to, you know, a larger set of interests, which is, you know, how could it be that for so long in the US and in Western Europe in particular, some of the people who are most ardently, you know, supportive of the Zionist project in Palestine are people who are very often, you know, on the left on all kinds of things, from eco-consciousness to you know, being on the political left in the US to supporting civil rights and feminism and so forth. Why is it that suddenly on this one question they become, you know, what are the mechanisms that enable their support for, you know, ethnic cleansing and home demolition and uprooting people and this kind of thing? And so the book is this exploration of this jumble of contradictions that seems to me to be captured most powerfully and nightmarishly in the museum project. So it's and you know, what does it mean to say that this shrine to tolerance, I can't help but laugh about it because it's so sick in some ways. What does it mean that this shrine to supposed tolerance is being built on the ruins of a graveyard, you know, and that they don't seem to see any, you know, no matter what people have said, the institution seems to find nothing wrong with this endeavor that it's engaged in. It's actually one of the only things, I mean, going back to the question of activism, if you want to go back to that, it's one of the only things that I've ever actually accomplished in a way that I could say I helped do this thing, which is that the original architect for this thing was Frank Gehry. And when I wrote about it a few years ago, it led to kind of unpleasant debate with Frank Gehry in print, but then he ended up pulling out of the project because of, I guess I helped kind of shed the light on this thing, and he ended up withdrawing from it. So at least I've helped accomplish, that's my one, you know, kind of accomplishment in the world out there, in a way that stopped it. It's still being built, unfortunately, but at least it's not a Frank Gehry. And, you know, the architect is this obscure kind of Israeli thing. So it's like, it's not, at least it's not a global luminary, but that's basically it. Yeah. So it's about the culture of denial. What does it mean that you can support a project of apartheid and ethnic cleansing and home demolition, but in the name of values like democracy and tolerance and greening the landscape and eco tolerance and this kind of thing. So.
Okay. So thank you so much. In terms of the Canner Forum, the next one will be on January 25th next year. And Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, the Anishinaabe writer, will talk about her writing and activism on behalf of Native American cultures, and Hoesta Moihane, who's here, will introduce her. And then we have another one in April with Mary Pat Brady from Cornell, in conversation with Marissa Lopez about Latinx activism. I also wanted to draw your attention to another event that's a little bit closer. In late November, on November 30th, just after Thanksgiving, the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who will attend the COP26 conference next week, will come and talk about Optopia from Fiction to Action on Climate Change. So this is a talk that I think will take up some of the issues that have come up here, but this time from the perspective of somebody who's mostly a creative writer, not so much a literary critic. So you're cordially invited to all of these events. And if you'd like more information, please follow UCLA English on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever your favorite social medium is. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.